I sat at my childhood dinner table watching my mother beam with pride as she praised my sister Carol for being the family's financial savior. The irony cut through me like a blade. For 18 months, I had been secretly paying our parents' mortgage utilities and credit card bills, watching from the shadows as Carol basked in undeserved glory. Every word of praise felt like a slap. Mom raised her wine glass and announced that Carol had gotten another promotion and would continue taking care of the family finances. My heart shattered into pieces as I realized my anonymous generosity had created a monster who was stealing my sacrifice and turning it into her triumph. 18 months earlier, my world changed forever when I discovered the devastating truth about my parents' financial situation. I had driven to their house in suburban Denver to help Mom organize her paperwork for tax season. Dad's small printing business, which had sustained our family for 23 years, had collapsed during the pandemic lockdowns. Corporate clients canceled contracts overnight, leaving him with expensive equipment payments but no income. While sorting through stacks of documents in the dining room where we now sat, I found notices that made my blood run cold. Past due mortgage statements showing they were 4 months behind on payments, utility disconnection warnings for electricity and gas, credit card statements with minimum payments marked overdue. The foreclosure letter was dated just 2 weeks ago. "Mom, what is all this?" I asked, holding up the mortgage notice with trembling hands. She glanced over from the kitchen where she was preparing lunch, her face immediately flushing with embarrassment. "Oh, honey, just some paperwork mix-ups. Nothing for you to worry about." But I could see the truth in her eyes, the shame, the fear, the desperate hope that somehow things would work out. Dad appeared in the doorway, his shoulders sagging with the weight of failure he carried. "We didn't want to burden you girls," he said quietly. "The business is gone, Lainey. 23 years of building something, and it vanished in 2 months. We've been living off savings, but that ran out in October. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for 6 weeks away. They owed $12,400 to bring the mortgage current, plus accumulated late fees and legal costs. The utility companies were demanding immediate payment of $3,200 or services would be disconnected within 10 days. That night, I lay awake calculating numbers in my head. As a 4th-grade teacher, my annual salary was $41,000. After taxes and my own modest expenses, I could manage their monthly bills if I eliminated every luxury from my life. No more dinners out, no weekend trips, no new clothes, unless absolutely necessary. I would drain my savings account and live paycheck to paycheck, but I could save their home. The next morning, I called their mortgage company and spoke with a customer service representative named Janet, who explained their options. I could set up anonymous payments through a third-party service that would handle all transactions without revealing my identity. The service charge was minimal, just $15 per month, and my parents would only know that someone was helping them. "Many families use this service when they want to help relatives maintain their dignity," Janet explained. "The payments appear as coming from a financial assistance program." I transferred $8,000 from my savings account that afternoon and authorized monthly payments of $1,200 for the mortgage, plus varying amounts for utilities and emergency repairs. My parents would never know their younger daughter was sacrificing everything to keep their home. Within 2 weeks, I watched Mom's face transform with relief as she told me their financial advisor had worked out payment arrangements with all their creditors. She never questioned the miraculous turn of events, too grateful to analyze the details. The climactic twist was yet to come. My generosity was about to create consequences I never anticipated, setting the stage for betrayal that would tear our family apart. 3 months into my secret payment plan, I began noticing changes in how my family talked about their financial recovery. During Sunday dinners, Mom would enthusiastically praise Carol's business connections and financial expertise, crediting her real estate career with solving their crisis. "Thank goodness Carol knows people in the banking industry," Mom would say, refilling our coffee cups. She negotiated with the mortgage company and got us special payment arrangements that regular people could never access. I listened with growing confusion as the story evolved each week. Carol, who lived 2 hours away in Colorado Springs, supposedly drove to Denver multiple times to meet with bank officials on their behalf. She had allegedly used her professional reputation to secure reduced interest rates and penalty forgiveness that saved them thousands of dollars. Carol spent her entire Saturday last week on conference calls with our creditors. Dad would add, his voice filled with admiration. She knows exactly which buttons to push with these financial institutions. The narrative became more elaborate as months passed. According to Mom's version of events, Carol had personally guaranteed some of their debts using her real estate license as collateral. She was supposedly managing their monthly budget, coordinating payment schedules, and even monitoring their credit scores for improvements. I felt increasingly bewildered by these stories because I knew the truth. Every month I transferred $1,200 from my checking account to cover their mortgage payment. I paid their electric bill, gas bill, water bill, and trash collection fees through online banking. When their water heater failed in February, I anonymously sent $800 to cover the replacement. None of this required any intervention from Carol or anyone else. The breaking point came during a conversation with our neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who lived across the street from my parents. I had stopped by her house to return a casserole dish when she mentioned how proud she was of our family's success story. "Your mother talks about Carol constantly at the grocery store, Mrs. Henderson said, adjusting her reading glasses. "She says Carol saved their house with her business connections. Such a devoted daughter to sacrifice her own finances for her parents." My stomach dropped as I realized the scope of the deception. Not only were my parents giving Carol credit for my sacrifices, but they were sharing this false narrative throughout their entire social circle. Their friends at church, neighbors on the block, relatives at family gatherings, everyone believed Carol was the heroic daughter who rescued them from foreclosure. That evening, I decided to investigate further. I called Carol under the pretense of asking about her work, hoping to understand how this confusion had started. "I've been so busy with real estate deals lately," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "The market is incredible right now. I just closed on a luxury listing that earned me a $43,000 commission in one transaction." Her words hit me like a physical blow. While I was draining my savings and living on ramen noodles to fund our parents' bills, Carol was earning more in single real estate deals than I made in an entire year of teaching. Yet somehow she was receiving all the credit for financial generosity I could barely afford. "Mom mentioned you've been helping with their financial situation," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Oh, that," Carol laughed dismissively. "I just gave them some advice about dealing with creditors. You know how dramatic Mom gets about money problems. Everything seems like a crisis to her." The casual way she minimized their genuine financial emergency while accepting praise for solving it made my hands shake with anger. I realized that somewhere along the way, my anonymous generosity had been hijacked by my sister's desire for family approval. The climactic twist revealed itself in that moment. Carol wasn't just passively accepting undeserved credit. She had deliberately constructed this elaborate fiction about her financial heroism, knowing full well that someone else was actually paying our parents' bills. The question now was whether she knew that someone was me. Dad's 72nd birthday dinner took place at Romano's Italian restaurant, the same family establishment where we had celebrated every major milestone for the past 15 years. The private dining room was decorated with balloons and family photos, creating a warm atmosphere that masked the tension I felt building throughout the evening. Carol arrived fashionably late, making a grand entrance in a designer dress and expensive jewelry that sparkled under the restaurant's chandelier lighting. She kissed Dad's cheek and handed him an elegantly wrapped gift, while apologizing for her delayed arrival due to closing a major real estate deal. "Sorry I'm late, everyone. I was finalizing paperwork for a $750,000 property sale," she announced, ensuring everyone heard about her professional success. As we ordered appetizers and entrees, the conversation naturally turned to family updates and achievements. Carol dominated the discussion with stories about her thriving real estate career, her recent purchase of a luxury SUV, and her plans to buy a vacation cabin in the mountains. Business has been absolutely phenomenal this year, she said, twirling pasta around her fork with practiced elegance. I'm on track to earn more than I've ever made in my entire career. Mom beamed with maternal pride as she listened to Carol's success stories. We're so fortunate to have such an accomplished daughter. Carol has been our financial guardian angel this past year and a half. The praise continued throughout dinner, with Mom and Dad taking turns recounting how Carol had supposedly saved their home and restored their financial stability. They described her negotiations with creditors, her connections in the banking industry, and her personal sacrifices on their behalf. Carol restructured all our debts and got us payment plans we never could have arranged ourselves, Dad explained to the server who was refilling our water glasses. She used her professional reputation to vouch for us. I sat quietly cutting my chicken parmesan into smaller and smaller pieces while listening to this elaborate fiction being presented as family history. Every word of praise for Carol felt like a denial of my own sacrifices. Every grateful smile from my parents reminded me how invisible my contributions had become. When the check arrived, I reached for my wallet and placed a $10 bill on the table to contribute toward the tip. It was a modest gesture representing about half of what remained in my checking account after paying our parents' monthly bills. Mom glanced at my contribution and her expression immediately shifted to one of amused condescension. Her voice carried across the dining room as she said loudly, "You only sent 10 cents. Carol covers all the bills." The other diners turned to look at our table. The server paused while collecting plates from the neighboring booth. I felt heat rising in my cheeks as everyone stared at the woman who was apparently too cheap to contribute adequately to her own father's birthday celebration. "I've been paying everything," I whispered desperately, hoping to correct the misunderstanding without creating a scene. But Mom's response was swift and cutting. "Stop stealing her glory!" She snapped her voice sharp enough to silence conversations at surrounding tables. "Carol sacrificed her savings for us while you've been focused on your own little teacher life." In that moment, I caught Carol's expression and realized the devastating truth. She wasn't confused or surprised by my claim about paying the bills. Instead, there was a knowing smirk playing at the corners of her mouth, a look of satisfied triumph that told me everything I needed to understand. The climactic twist hit me like a physical blow. Carol knew exactly what I had been doing for the past 18 months. She had discovered my secret payments and had been deliberately manipulating the situation to steal credit for my sacrifices. This wasn't a misunderstanding or coincidence. It was calculated betrayal by someone I had trusted completely. That night, I couldn't sleep. The humiliation from dinner replayed in my mind like a broken record. But more than that, I needed to understand exactly how Carol had discovered my secret and how long she had been manipulating the situation. I drove to her apartment complex at 11:30 in the evening, determined to confront her before my courage failed. She answered the door wearing silk pajamas that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her surprise at seeing me quickly replaced by wariness when she saw my expression. "Lainey, what are you doing here so late?" "We need to talk," I said, pushing past her into the spacious living room decorated with expensive furniture and artwork that clearly reflected her real estate success. I spread my bank statements, payment confirmations, and third-party service documentation across her glass coffee table, like evidence in a courtroom. 18 months of financial records proving every payment I had made, every sacrifice I had endured, every dollar I had transferred to keep our parents' home safe from foreclosure. "I want to know exactly when you figured out what I was doing and why you decided to steal credit for it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Carol glanced at the paperwork and then looked up at me with a laugh that contained no humor. "Oh, Lainey, you really thought you were so clever with your anonymous payments and secret generosity. When did you find out?" "About 6 months ago," she said, settling into her leather armchair with the casual confidence of someone who held all the cards. "There was a payment confirmation that got misfiled with some documents Mom asked me to help organize. Your name was right there in black and white as the funding source. The revelation hit me like a punch to the stomach. For 6 months, she had known the truth, while continuing to accept praise and gratitude that belonged to me. For 6 months, she had watched me struggle financially, while building her reputation as the family's financial savior. Why didn't you tell them the truth? Carol stood up and walked to her kitchen, returning with a bottle of expensive wine that she opened with practiced ease. Because it worked out perfectly for everyone. Mom and Dad got their bills paid. You got to feel like a martyr. And I got credit for being a devoted daughter. Everyone wins. Everyone wins. My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. I've been living on macaroni and cheese for 1.5 years, while you buy luxury cars and designer clothes. That's your choice, she said, pouring herself a generous glass of wine without offering me any. Nobody forced you to play anonymous benefactor. You could have just let them lose the house and deal with the consequences. I stared at her, realizing I was looking at a stranger who happened to share my DNA. The sister I had grown up with, the person I had trusted with my deepest secrets and biggest dreams, had transformed into someone capable of cold calculation and heartless manipulation. But here's the thing, little sister. Carol continued, her voice taking on a threatening tone. If you even think about exposing what you call the truth to Mom and Dad, I'll tell them that you've been controlling and manipulating them with secret money for over 1 year. I'll explain how you deliberately kept them in the dark about your financial assistance as a way to maintain power over their lives. She took a sip of wine and smiled with the confidence of someone who had planned this conversation months in advance. Who do you think they'll believe? The daughter who saved their house through professional expertise and business connections, or the daughter who admits she's been deceiving them for 18 months about where their bill payments were coming from? The wine glass in her hand caught the lamplight as she gestured dismissively. Besides, I've been using the money you freed up for some very smart cryptocurrency investments. I'm up about $60,000 in digital currency portfolios. When those investments mature, I'll have enough to buy a vacation home in Aspen. My legs felt weak as I understood the full scope of her betrayal. Not only had she stolen credit for my sacrifices, but she had been profiting financially from my generosity, while threatening to destroy my relationship with our parents if I exposed her deception. "You're sick," I whispered, gathering my documents from the coffee table. "I'm practical," she corrected. "You're the one who chose to play secret benefactor instead of just being honest from the beginning. This whole situation exists because you wanted to be a martyr more than you wanted to be a sister." As I walked toward her door, Carol called after me with one final twist of the knife. "Oh, and Lainey, thanks for making my life so much easier. It's nice having a sister who's willing to work so hard to make me look good." The climactic twist crystallized as I drove home through empty streets. Carol had not only discovered and exploited my secret payments, but she had turned my generosity into a weapon against me. She was profiting from my sacrifices while holding the threat of family destruction over my head. The question now was whether I had the courage to stop enabling her manipulation, even if it meant our parents might lose their home. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and my hands shaking as I prepared to take the most terrifying step of my life. The cursor hovered over the Cancel Recurring Payments button on my bank's website, and I felt like I was about to detonate a bomb that would destroy everything I had worked to protect. But Carol's threats and mockery had clarified something important for me. I wasn't helping my family by enabling her deception. I was participating in my own destruction while she profited from my pain. My anonymous generosity had become a tool for her manipulation, and continuing the payments would only make the situation worse. I clicked the button and watched 18 months of financial sacrifice disappear with a single mouse click. The mortgage payment that was scheduled to process in 3 days was canceled. The automatic utility payments I had set up were terminated. The emergency fund I maintained for their unexpected expenses was closed. Instead of transferring $1,200 to their mortgage company, I opened a high-yield savings account at a credit union across town and deposited the money there. For the first time in over 1 year, that money would work for me. instead of enabling a system built on lies. The immediate relief was overwhelming. I walked to the grocery store and bought fresh vegetables, quality meat, and name-brand products instead of generic alternatives. I purchased new jeans to replace the ones with holes in the knees. I even bought a book I had wanted to read for months instead of borrowing it from the library. But the relief quickly gave way to anxiety as I realized what would happen when the bills came due. My parents would receive past due notices within 2 weeks. Their mortgage payment would be marked late after a 10-day grace period. Utility companies would send disconnection warnings when payments failed to arrive on schedule. The question was whether Carol would step up to cover the expenses she claimed to be managing, or whether her lies would finally be exposed by reality. I didn't have to wait long for my answer. On the 14th day after canceling the payments, my phone rang at 6:47 in the morning. Carol's name appeared on the caller ID and I let it go to voicemail. She called again immediately, then sent a series of increasingly frantic text messages. "Lainey, call me back right now. Emergency with Mom and Dad." This isn't a game. Their mortgage payment bounced and they're panicking. "Whatever you think you're proving, you need to restart those payments today." I finally answered on her 7th call, curious to hear how she would handle the crisis now that her fictional financial management had been exposed by reality. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she demanded without any greeting or pleasantries. "I'm not doing anything," I replied calmly. "I stopped doing something. There's a difference." Mom called me sobbing this morning because the bank left a voicemail about a missed payment. She thinks there's been some kind of mistake with the automatic payment system I supposedly set up for them. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I would look into it and fix the problem, but I need you to restart those payments immediately. This isn't the time for whatever petty revenge game you think you're playing." The desperation in her voice was something I had never heard before. For 18 months, Carol had been confident and in control, secure in her deception, and comfortable with her manipulation. Now she was facing the consequences of claiming credit for financial responsibilities she couldn't actually fulfill. "I'm not playing any games," I said. "I'm just no longer participating in your fraud. If you've been managing their finances like you told everyone, then manage them. Handle the mortgage payment, cover the utilities, take care of the emergency repairs. Show Mom and Dad what a devoted daughter actually does, instead of what a devoted daughter claims to do. You know I can't afford to pay their bills every month. My income is inconsistent and I have my own expenses to cover. What about your $60,000 cryptocurrency profits that you mentioned last week?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Carol finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The market crashed last Tuesday. I lost everything I had invested plus some money I borrowed against my real estate commissions. I'm actually in debt about $40,000 right now." The climactic twist hit me like lightning. Carol's arrogance and greed had destroyed her financial safety net, just as her lies were being exposed by reality. She had gambled with money that wasn't hers to lose betting on investments she didn't understand, and now she was facing the consequences of both her deception and her recklessness. "Please, Lainey," she begged, abandoning all pretense of superiority or control. "Just restart the payments temporarily while I figure out how to get out of this mess. I'll find a way to pay you back eventually, I promise." "That's interesting," I said, enjoying the reversal of power for the first time in 18 months. "Because last week you told me I was choosing to be a martyr and that this whole situation was my fault for wanting to play secret benefactor. Now you're begging me to resume the same payments you were mocking. I was upset and said things I didn't mean. Please don't let Mom and Dad suffer because you're angry with me." "I'm not making them suffer. You are. You created this situation by stealing credit for my work, and now you need to deal with the consequences. If you want to be the family's financial hero, then be one. Otherwise, tell them the truth about what's been happening for the past 18 months. I hung up before she could respond, but she called back immediately. This time, I let it go to voicemail. She left 7 messages over the next 2 hours, each one more desperate than the last. But the real test was yet to come. Within days, my parents would discover that their financial stability had been an illusion built on lies and manipulation. The question was whether they would demand accountability from the daughter who had deceived them, or whether they would blame the daughter who had been secretly protecting them. The phone calls from my parents started on the Tuesday morning of the following week. Mom's voice was trembling with panic when I answered, immediately launching into a breathless explanation of their crisis without any greeting. "Lainey, honey, something terrible has happened with our mortgage payment. The bank called yesterday saying we're behind, but that can't be right because Carol set up automatic payments months ago. There must be some kind of computer error or banking mistake." I gripped the phone tighter, knowing this was the moment when Carol's house of cards would begin collapsing. "What did the bank tell you exactly?" "They said our April payment never came through and now we're past the grace period. They want the full amount plus late fees by Friday, or they'll start foreclosure proceedings again. But Carol promised us this could never happen with the system she arranged." Mom's faith in Carol's fictional financial management was absolute, even when faced with contradictory evidence from the mortgage company. She couldn't imagine that her successful real estate daughter had been lying to them for months about managing their bills. "Maybe you should call Carol and ask her to check with the bank about what went wrong," I suggested carefully. I tried calling her yesterday, but she said she was in meetings with clients all day and would look into it today. She seemed very busy and stressed about some big real estate deals that were closing this week. I knew the real reason Carol was avoiding their calls, but I couldn't explain that without revealing the entire deception. Instead, I offered to help them contact the mortgage company directly to understand their options. "Oh, would you do that, sweetheart? Carol usually handles all the financial communications for us, but since she's so busy right now, maybe you could just find out what paperwork needs to be fixed to get the automatic payments working again." That afternoon, Dad called separately, his voice heavy with the shame and fear that had defined his relationship with money since his business failed. Unlike Mom, who believed in technical solutions to their problems, Dad understood they were facing a genuine financial crisis. "Lainey, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me," he said after we exchanged basic greetings. "Of course, Dad. What is it?" "Do you think there's any chance Carol might be having financial problems of her own? I know she's been very generous with us, but some of the things she's said lately about her business don't quite add up." My heart raced as I realized Dad was beginning to see through Carol's deception independently. His experience as a small business owner had taught him to recognize the signs when someone was stretching the truth about their financial situation. "What makes you think that?" "Well, she keeps talking about these huge commission checks, but last month she asked if she could borrow my truck to move some furniture because her car was in the shop. When I offered to pay for a rental truck, she got very defensive and said money wasn't the issue. But if she's earning as much as she claims, why would she need to borrow my old pickup truck?" Dad's question revealed something I hadn't considered. Carol's lifestyle inflation and risky investments had probably left her with serious cash flow problems even before her cryptocurrency losses. Her expensive apartment luxury car payments and designer clothing required consistent income that real estate commissions couldn't always provide. "Also," Dad continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "your mother doesn't know this, but we got some other past due notices yesterday. The electric company wants $860, and the gas company is threatening disconnection if we don't pay $340 by Thursday." The scope of their financial crisis was expanding beyond just the mortgage payment. Every bill I had been paying anonymously was now coming due, simultaneously creating a perfect storm that would overwhelm any single person's ability to resolve quickly. "Dad, how much do you and Mom actually know about the payment arrangements Carol supposedly set up? Do you have any paperwork or account numbers or contact information for these automatic payment systems?" "That's just it, honey. Carol said she would handle all the details so we wouldn't have to worry about the complicated financial stuff. She told us to just forward any bills to her, and she would make sure everything got paid through her business connections." The complete picture of Carol's deception was becoming clear. She had isolated our parents from their own financial information, making them dependent on her supposed expertise, while ensuring they couldn't independently verify any of her claims. Lainey, I need to ask you for a favor, and I hate asking because I know you work so hard for your teaching salary. Dad said, his voice breaking with emotion. Could you possibly lend us enough money to cover the immediate bills while Carol sorts out whatever went wrong with the banking systems? I'll pay you back as soon as we figure out this mess. The heartbreak in his voice was almost unbearable. Here was a man who had worked his entire life to provide for his family, reduced to begging his daughter for money to keep their utilities connected. And he was asking the daughter, who had been secretly supporting them for 18 months, while another daughter took credit for the assistance. Let me see what I can do, Dad, I said, knowing I had the money sitting in my new savings account but unable to explain why without exposing the entire situation. Thank you, sweetheart. I don't know what we'd do without our girls. Even if Carol is having some temporary business problems, at least we know we can count on family to help each other out. After I hung up, I realized the climactic twist had revealed itself. My parents were about to lose everything they thought Carol had saved, and they were turning to me for rescue without knowing I had been their rescuer all along. The irony was devastating, but it also created an opportunity for truth that had never existed before. The emergency family meeting took place on Sunday afternoon in my parents' living room, the same space where I had discovered their financial crisis 18 months earlier. The atmosphere was thick with tension and unspoken accusations as we gathered around the coffee table covered with past due notices, disconnection warnings, and foreclosure documents. Mom had called the meeting after spending 3 days trying unsuccessfully to reach Carol, who'd been avoiding their calls and responding to text messages with vague promises to handle everything soon. Dad sat in his recliner, looking defeated and exhausted while Mom paced nervously between the kitchen and living room. I don't understand how this could have happened. Mom kept repeating, wringing her hands as she moved. Carol promised us that her payment system was foolproof. She said we would never have to worry about missed payments or late fees again. Carol arrived 20 minutes late, immediately apologizing and explaining that she had been dealing with a complicated real estate closing that required her immediate attention. She was dressed impeccably as always, but I could see signs of stress in the way she kept checking her phone and the tightness around her eyes. I'm so sorry about the confusion with the mortgage payment, she said, settling into the armchair across from me. There was a technical glitch with the automatic payment system I set up through my business banking contacts. These things happen sometimes with electronic transfers, but I'm working on getting it resolved. What about the utility bills? Dad asked, holding up the stack of past due notices. The electric company says we haven't made a payment in 6 weeks. Same issue, Carol replied smoothly, though I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her purse. Everything was routed through the same electronic system, so when one payment failed, it created a cascade effect that disrupted all the others. She pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it to reveal what appeared to be official banking documents, though from my angle, I couldn't see the details clearly. The good news is that my business contacts at the bank have agreed to waive all the late fees and penalties as a professional courtesy. She continued with growing confidence. We just need to make the current payments to get everything back on track. How much money are we talking about? Mom asked, sitting down heavily on the sofa next to Dad. About $3,400 to cover everything immediately due. Plus, I'll need to restart the automatic payments for ongoing monthly expenses. I watched this performance with fascination and disgust, amazed at how effortlessly Carol could weave lies into seemingly credible explanations. Her fictional banking contacts and imaginary technical glitches sounded plausible enough to satisfy our parents' desperate need to believe their financial problems had simple solutions. But I also knew something Carol didn't know. I knew she was flat broke and in debt with no ability to produce even $300, let alone $3,400. Carol, I said quietly, can you show us the actual account statements for these automatic payment systems you set up? I'd like to see how the money has been flowing for the past 18 months. Her eyes snapped to mine with a look of surprise and wariness. Why would you need to see those documents? This is just a temporary technical problem that will be resolved within a few business days. Because Dad asked me if I could lend them money to cover the immediate bills, and before I write a check for $3,400, I want to understand exactly how their finances have been managed. Mom looked confused by my request. Honey, Carol has been handling all of this for us. We don't need to burden you with the complicated details. Actually, I think we do, I said, standing up and walking to my car to retrieve the folder I had prepared for this moment. When I returned, I spread my 18 months of bank statements, payment confirmations, and third-party service documentation across their coffee table with the same deliberate precision I had used at Carol's apartment. Before anyone writes any checks or makes any promises about fixing technical problems, I think everyone should know exactly how these bills have been getting paid for the past year and a half. The room fell silent as my parents stared at the documents. Dad picked up a bank statement and examined it carefully, his business experience, allowing him to quickly understand what he was seeing. "Lainey, what is all this?" Mom asked, though her voice suggested she was beginning to understand. "These are records of every payment I've made toward your mortgage, utilities, and emergency expenses since February of last year. Every month for 18 months, I've been transferring money from my teaching salary to keep your house safe from foreclosure." Dad's face went pale as he traced the payment dates with his finger. "You mean you've been paying our bills this whole time? The mortgage payment, electric bill, gas bill, water bill, trash collection, and emergency repairs. Everything Carol has been taking credit for." I turned to look directly at Carol, who had gone completely silent and was staring at her hands folded in her lap. "And Carol has known about my payments for at least 6 months, but instead of telling you the truth, she decided to continue accepting your gratitude and praise for my sacrifices." The explosion came from Mom, whose voice rose to a level I had never heard before. "That can't be true. Carol has been using her business connections to negotiate with the creditors. She's been sacrificing her own savings to help us." But Dad was still examining my documentation, cross-referencing dates and amounts with their mortgage statements and utility bills. His accounting background made it impossible for him to deny the mathematical truth laid out in black and white. "Margaret," he said quietly to Mom, using her full name in the way that indicated serious conversation. "These payment dates match exactly with every month we thought we were current on our bills." Carol finally looked up, and I could see tears forming in her eyes as she realized her deception had been completely exposed. "I was trying to help," she said weakly. "When I found out Lainey was making the payments, I thought it would be easier for everyone if Mom and Dad believed the money was coming through my business connections. I didn't want them to feel guilty about Lainey sacrificing so much." "You didn't want them to feel guilty." I repeated, my voice rising with 18 months of suppressed anger. "Or you didn't want to give up the praise and admiration you were receiving for my work." "It's not like that," Carol protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then explain your cryptocurrency investments." I continued, determined to reveal the full scope of her betrayal. "Explain how you've been using the money I freed up by paying their bills to gamble on digital currency speculation. Explain how you lost $60,000 while taking credit for my financial sacrifices." The climactic twist exploded in that moment as our parents realized they had been manipulated by both daughters in different ways, and that their financial stability had been maintained through deception rather than genuine family support. The silence that followed my revelation lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. I expected relief, gratitude, maybe even apologies for the way I had been treated. Instead, what happened next completely blindsided me and changed everything I thought I understood about my family. Mom was the first to speak, and her voice was sharp with anger rather than appreciation. "Lainey, how could you deceive us like this? How could you make us feel like charity cases by secretly paying our bills without our knowledge or permission?" I stared at her in shock, unable to process what I was hearing. "I was trying to help you save your home. You were facing foreclosure." "That's not the point." Dad said, his face flushed with embarrassment and indignation. You made us live a lie for 18 months. Every time we felt proud about getting back on our feet, every time we felt good about managing our finances responsibly, we were actually just unknowing participants in your deception. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Somehow my parents had transformed my sacrificial generosity into an act of betrayal against them. You should have told us the truth from the beginning. Mom continued, her voice growing louder with each word. Instead, you snuck around behind our backs like we were children who couldn't handle our own affairs. But you couldn't handle your own affairs, I protested. You were 4 months behind on your mortgage payment and about to lose the house. The utility companies were threatening disconnection. What was I supposed to do? Let you become homeless? You were supposed to trust us enough to be honest, Dad replied. You were supposed to respect us enough to let us make our own decisions about how to handle our financial problems. I looked around the room desperately, trying to understand how I had become the villain in this story. Carol was sitting quietly watching my parents attack me for the same actions that had earned her 18 months of praise and gratitude. Wait a minute, I said, my voice shaking with confusion and hurt. You're angry with me for paying your bills secretly, but you've been praising Carol for months for supposedly doing exactly the same thing. How is that different? It's different because Carol was open about helping us. Mom explained, though, her logic made no sense given what we had just learned. She told us she was using her business connections to negotiate with our creditors. She kept us informed about what was happening with our finances. But none of that was true. She was lying about everything. That's not Carol's fault, Dad said, his voice taking on a defensive tone. She was just trying to protect us from feeling guilty about your sacrifices. If you had been honest from the beginning, none of this confusion would have happened. I felt like I was trapped in an alternate reality where facts and logic had been suspended. My parents were simultaneously angry with me for lying about helping them and grateful to Carol for lying about helping them. Look, Mom said, her tone becoming more reasonable but still accusatory. We appreciate what you were trying to do, honey, but the way you went about it was manipulative and controlling. You made us dance like puppets while you pulled the strings from behind the scenes. How is paying your bills manipulative? Because you kept it secret, Dad explained. You watched us worry about money, watched us stress about making payments, watched us feel grateful to Carol, and you never said a word. That's emotional manipulation, whether you meant it to be or not. Carol finally spoke up, her voice soft and apologetic. Mom and Dad are right, Lainey. When I found out what you were doing, I should have told them immediately instead of trying to protect everyone's feelings. I made a mistake by not being completely transparent. The way she phrased her apology made it sound like her only error had been failing to expose my deception quickly enough, rather than actively stealing credit for my work and lying to our parents for months. I don't understand, I said, feeling tears of frustration building behind my eyes. Carol has been taking credit for my payments, spending the money I saved you on risky investments, and lying to your faces about managing your finances. But somehow I'm the one who was being manipulative and controlling. Sweetheart, Mom said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. We understand you're upset that Carol got credit for your financial help, but the real problem here is that neither of you girls trusted us enough to be honest about what was happening. That's not true, I protested. I was trying to preserve your dignity by not making you feel like you needed charity from your daughter. Our dignity. Dad's voice rose with indignation. What's dignified about living a lie? What's dignified about feeling proud of financial stability that was actually being provided by secret payments we knew nothing about? I realized that my parents' reaction was coming from a place of wounded pride rather than rational analysis. They were embarrassed about needing help, angry about being deceived, and looking for someone to blame for their complicated emotions. Since Carol had positioned herself as trying to protect them, while I had positioned myself as helping them secretly, I had become the target of their frustration. The climactic twist was devastating in its irony. My attempt to preserve my parents' dignity through anonymous generosity had been reframed as an attack on their dignity through secret manipulation. Meanwhile, Carol's deliberate theft of credit for my work had been recast as a misguided attempt to protect everyone's feelings. "I think," Dad said with finality, "we need some time to process all of this. Both you girls made mistakes, but right now we need to focus on solving our immediate financial problems rather than arguing about who did what wrong." As I gathered my documentation from their coffee table, I realized that exposing the truth had accomplished nothing except making me the primary target of blame for a situation I had never wanted to create in the first place. Word about our family financial crisis spread through our extended family network with the speed and distortion typical of telephone games. By Wednesday morning, I was receiving calls and text messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins who had heard various versions of what had happened at our emergency family meeting. The first call came from Aunt Patricia Mom's older sister who lived in Phoenix but maintained close contact with everyone through social media and weekly phone conversations. Her version of events had been filtered through Mom's perspective, which meant I was cast as the primary villain in a story about family deception and manipulation. "Lainey, I just got off the phone with your mother, and I have to say I'm very disappointed in how you've handled this situation." Patricia began without any greeting or pleasantries. "What did she tell you exactly?" "She explained how you've been secretly controlling your parents' finances for over a year, while letting poor Carol take responsibility for arrangements she didn't actually make. Do you realize how embarrassing this has been for your sister?" I gripped the phone tighter, amazed at how completely the narrative had been twisted. Did she mention that Carol knew about my payments for months and deliberately chose to accept credit for them instead of telling the truth? "Carol was trying to protect everyone from an awkward situation that you created by being secretive in the first place," Patricia replied, clearly repeating Mom's interpretation of events. "If you had just been honest about wanting to help, none of this drama would have happened." They were facing foreclosure, Aunt Patricia. They were about to lose their house. Was I supposed to let that happen while we held family meetings about the best way to approach the subject sensitively? "You were supposed to trust your family enough to include them in important decisions about their own lives. Instead, you treated them like children who couldn't handle the truth about their financial situation." The conversation continued in this vein for 20 minutes with Patricia lecturing me about respect, honesty, and family values, while completely ignoring the fact that I had prevented our parents from becoming homeless. By the time I hung up, I felt exhausted and defensive. But Patricia was just the beginning. Uncle Donald, Dad's younger brother, who lived in Denver, called that afternoon with his own version of righteous indignation. "I heard about what happened with your folks' mortgage situation," he said, his tone suggesting I was in serious trouble. "Your dad sounded really upset when he called me last night." "What did he tell you?" "He said you've been playing some kind of mind game with secret payments while letting Carol think she was helping manage their finances. That's pretty manipulative behavior, Lainey. Carol wasn't helping manage their finances. She was lying about managing their finances while I actually paid their bills." "That's not how your dad explained it to me. He said Carol was trying to coordinate financial assistance through her business connections, and you undermined her efforts by going behind everyone's back." I realized that my parents had been sharing a sanitized version of events that minimized Carol's deception while emphasizing my secrecy. In their retelling, Carol became a well-meaning daughter, whose legitimate efforts to help were complicated by my decision to provide anonymous assistance. "Uncle Donald, did Dad mention that Carol has been taking credit for my payments for 6 months? Did he tell you that she's been accepting praise and gratitude for financial sacrifices I made while she spent her own money on luxury items and risky investments? All I know is what your father told me, and he said this whole mess could have been avoided if you had just been upfront about wanting to help instead of playing secret benefactor." The pattern continued throughout the week. Cousin Jennifer called to express concern about family communication problems. Aunt Susan sent a long text message about the importance of honesty in relationships. Even Grandma Rose, who was usually more perceptive than the rest of the family, left a voicemail asking me to think carefully about how my actions might have contributed to this unfortunate situation. But the most painful call came from my cousin Michael, who was close to my age and had always been someone I could talk to honestly about family dynamics. "I'm really confused about what happened with your parents' financial stuff," he said when I called him back after seeing several missed calls. "Everyone's talking about it, but the stories don't really make sense." "What are you hearing?" "Carol told my mom that you set her up by secretly paying bills and then exposing her when she tried to take some credit for helping. She said you deliberately created a situation where she would look bad no matter what she did. Is that really what you think happened?" I don't know what to think, but Carol seemed really upset when she talked to my mom. She said she's always felt like you resented her success, and this was your way of making her look irresponsible in front of the whole family. The fact that Carol was now positioning herself as the victim of my manipulation was infuriating, but I also realized that her version of events was gaining traction because it appealed to family members who wanted a simple explanation for a complicated situation. "Michael, let me ask you something. If you found out that someone in your family was facing foreclosure, would you help them secretly to preserve their dignity, or would you call a family meeting to discuss the best approach while their house was being auctioned off?" "I'd probably try to help them," he admitted. "And if someone else in the family took credit for your help while you struggled financially to provide it, how would you feel?" "I'd be pretty angry," he said quietly. "That's exactly what happened. But somehow I've become the villain because I didn't handle the situation perfectly." The climactic twist in this extended family drama was becoming clear. Carol had successfully reframed the narrative to make herself appear as an innocent victim, caught between my manipulation and our parents' needs. By focusing on my secrecy rather than her deception, she had turned extended family members into allies who saw me as the primary source of family dysfunction. As I hung up from Michael's call, I realized that exposing the truth about the financial payments had accomplished nothing except isolating me from the very people I had been trying to protect and support. 6 weeks passed without any resolution to the financial crisis. Despite all the family drama and accusations, no one had actually stepped forward with the $3,400 needed to bring my parents' accounts current. Carol continued to promise that she was working on solutions through her business connections, but her promises were growing increasingly vague and desperate. I maintained my position of refusing to restart the anonymous payments, though every day felt like emotional torture as I watched my parents sink deeper into debt. The money sat in my high-yield savings account, earning interest while their situation deteriorated. Some nights I lay awake wondering if my principles were worth the price my family was paying. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late May, when I received a frantic call from Mom at 7:15, just as I was leaving for school. "Lainey, you need to come over right away," she said, her voice high with panic. "Something terrible has happened with the house." I called in a substitute teacher and drove straight to their neighborhood, where I found a small crowd of neighbors gathered on the sidewalk across from my parents' house. A sheriff's deputy was posting a bright yellow notice on their front door, while a court official took photographs of the property. The foreclosure notice was official and final. The house would be sold at public auction in exactly 30 days, unless the full amount of past due payments, legal fees, and penalties was paid immediately. The total now stood at $4,700, having grown with additional late fees and processing costs. Dad stood in the driveway wearing his bathrobe and slippers, his face gray with humiliation, as neighbors whispered and pointed. Mrs. Henderson from across the street approached me with genuine concern in her eyes. "Honey, is there anything we can do to help? Your parents are such good people and we hate to see them going through this." The public nature of their financial crisis made everything worse. After months of pretending their problems had been resolved through Carol's business expertise, now the entire neighborhood could see the truth posted on their front door in official legal language. Mom was inside the house making desperate phone calls to anyone who might have suggestions or connections. I heard her talking to their church pastor, asking if the congregation had any emergency assistance programs. She called Dad's former business partner, hoping he might know of temporary work opportunities. She even contacted the local newspaper to ask if they had information about housing assistance programs for seniors. But the call that broke my heart was the one she made to Carol, which I overheard from the kitchen, where I was making coffee with shaking hands. "Carol, honey, we need those business connections right now. The sheriff just posted a foreclosure notice, and we have 30 days to come up with almost $5,000, or we lose the house. Can your banking contacts do anything to help us at this point?" I couldn't hear Carol's response, but I could see Mom's face falling as she listened. "What do you mean the connections fell through? You said you had arrangements in place to handle situations exactly like this." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Mom's voice becoming increasingly desperate and confused, as Carol apparently explained that her business network couldn't provide the kind of immediate financial assistance they needed. When Mom hung up, she sat staring at the phone for a long time before looking up at me with tears in her eyes. "Carol says her business contacts are all tied up with regulatory issues right now, and none of them can arrange emergency funding on such short notice. She feels terrible about it, but there's nothing she can do." I wanted to scream that there had never been any business contacts or special arrangements, that the entire foundation of their financial recovery had been built on lies, but I knew it would only make things worse. "What about the money in your retirement accounts?" I asked, knowing they had a small IRA from Dad's business years. "We already borrowed against that during the first few months after the business failed. There's maybe $800 left, but we can't access it without huge penalties." Dad appeared in the doorway, having changed out of his bathrobe into clothes that made him look slightly more dignified despite the circumstances. "I called the mortgage company to see if we could arrange a payment plan," he said, settling heavily into his recliner. "They said once a foreclosure notice has been posted, they can't accept partial payments. We need the full amount by June 21st, or the house goes to auction." The deadline was exactly 28 days away. I did quick calculations in my head and realized that even if I restarted payments immediately, there wouldn't be enough time to accumulate the full amount they needed through my monthly transfers. "There is one option." Dad continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "We could sell the house ourselves before the auction date. That way we'd have some control over the sale price and might get enough to pay off the mortgage and have a little left over for a security deposit on an apartment." The idea of my parents losing their home of 31 years was devastating, but the alternative was watching it be sold at a foreclosure auction, where they would receive nothing and their credit would be destroyed permanently. "How much time would you need to sell it?" I asked. "Our neighbor Tom works in real estate, and he said in this market we could probably get a cash offer within 2 weeks if we priced it competitively, but we'd have to accept significantly less than what the house is worth because of the time pressure." I realized this was the moment when I had to make a decision that would define my relationship with my family for the rest of our lives. I could restart the payments and add enough additional money to bring their accounts current, saving their home and preserving their stability. Or I could maintain my position and watch them lose everything they had worked for. But I also knew that simply writing a check wouldn't solve the underlying problems. Carol's deception would continue. My parents would remain in denial about what had really happened, and I would go back to being an invisible benefactor while she received credit for my sacrifices. The climactic twist crystallized as I looked at my parents sitting in their living room, surrounded by foreclosure documents and eviction timelines. They were finally facing the consequences of believing lies instead of acknowledging truth, and I held the power to either rescue them once again or force them to confront reality. "Mom, Dad," I said carefully, "before we talk about selling the house or any other options, I need to know something. If someone offered to help you avoid foreclosure right now, would you want to know exactly where that help was coming from and what it would require from your family?" They looked at each other with confusion and hope, not understanding that I was offering them one last chance to choose truth over comfortable deception. The conversation that followed was the most difficult of my adult life. I sat across from my parents in their living room, watching the afternoon sunlight stream through windows of a house that might not belong to them much longer, and prepared to either save or lose my family forever. "I can prevent you from losing this house," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "I have enough money saved to bring all your accounts current and cover the legal fees. But if I do this, it's going to be on completely different terms than what's happened for the past 18 months. Dad leaned forward in his chair, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time since the foreclosure notice had been posted. "What kind of terms?" "Complete financial transparency from everyone in this family. No more secrets, no more lies, no more taking credit for things you didn't do. If I pay these bills, everyone acknowledges publicly that I've been supporting you financially, and everyone admits the truth about how we got to this point." Mom shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. "Sweetheart, we've already been through all this drama about who paid what and when. Can't we just focus on solving the immediate problem?" "No, we can't," I replied firmly, "because the immediate problem is a symptom of a bigger issue. This family has been operating on lies and manipulation for 6 months, and until that stops, these financial crises are going to keep happening." I pulled a folder from my purse containing documents I had prepared after sleepless nights of planning this conversation. "Here's exactly what I'm proposing. I'll pay the $4,700 to stop the foreclosure. Plus, I'll cover your monthly bills for 6 more months while you get back on your feet. But in exchange, I want formal loan agreements with payment schedules, public acknowledgement of my financial support, and Carol agrees to enter debt counseling and financial therapy." Dad examined the loan agreement I had drafted, which specified monthly payments of $200 starting in January, with the full amount to be repaid within 3 years at 0 interest. "This seems very reasonable," he said slowly. "But why do we need to make public announcements about your help? Why can't we just handle this privately within the family?" "Because for 18 months this family has been publicly praising Carol for financial help she never provided, while I sacrificed my savings and lived on macaroni and cheese. I'm tired of being invisible while someone else gets credit for my work." Mom looked stricken by the harshness in my voice. "Honey, we never meant to make you feel unappreciated. We just believed what Carol told us about her business arrangements." "And that's exactly the problem," I said. "You believed what was convenient and comfortable, instead of asking questions that might have revealed uncomfortable truths. You preferred Carol's story about business connections and special deals because it made you feel less like charity cases." I stood up and walked to their front window, looking out at the foreclosure notice that was still attracting attention from passing neighbors. "I also want Carol to admit publicly that she knew about my payments and deliberately took false credit for them. And I want her to explain to everyone how she spent the money I saved you on cryptocurrency investments that she lost through reckless speculation." "Now wait a minute," Dad said, his voice taking on a defensive tone. "Carol made some mistakes, but she was trying to help in her own way. We don't need to humiliate her in front of the extended family. She humiliated herself by lying and stealing credit for my work. I'm just asking for honesty about what actually happened." Mom was shaking her head with the stubborn determination I remembered from childhood arguments. "This is exactly what I was talking about when I said your secrecy was manipulative. Now you're using money as a weapon to control how our family deals with private matters." "I'm not using money as a weapon. I'm using money as a tool to create accountability. For 18 months, I enabled dysfunction by providing anonymous support that allowed everyone to avoid responsibility. I'm not willing to do that anymore." The room fell silent except for the ticking of their grandfather clock and the distant sound of neighborhood children playing outside. I realized I was asking my parents to choose between financial security and emotional comfort, between keeping their house and maintaining their illusions about family dynamics. "What happens if we don't agree to your conditions?" Dad asked quietly. "Then you'll need to find another solution to your financial problems. Sell the house, move to an apartment, declare bankruptcy, ask other family members for help. Whatever you decide, but it won't involve my money unless it also involves complete honesty about how we got here. Sweetheart. Mom said, her voice taking on the pleading tone she used when she wanted me to be reasonable. Can't you just help us because we're family? Why does everything have to be so complicated with contracts and public announcements and requirements for your sister? Because family should be honest with each other. Because people who love you shouldn't steal credit for your sacrifices. Because I'm tired of being taken for granted while someone else gets praised for my work. I gathered my documents and prepared to leave, giving them time to consider their options without pressure from my presence. You have until Thursday to decide, I said. That gives you enough time to explore other alternatives if you don't want to accept my terms. But after Thursday, this offer expires and you'll need to handle the foreclosure situation without my involvement. As I reached their front door, Dad called after me with a question that revealed how little he understood about the choice they were facing. Lainey, if we agree to your conditions, does that mean Carol won't be welcome in this family anymore? It means Carol will need to take responsibility for her actions and work to rebuild trust instead of continuing to manipulate situations for her own benefit. Whether she's willing to do that is up to her. The climactic twist was clear as I walked to my car. My parents were being forced to choose between financial rescue and maintaining comfortable lives while I was risking everything on the belief that truth was worth more than keeping peace in a family built on deception. Thursday morning arrived with no phone call from my parents. I had given them 3 full days to consider my ultimatum, and their silence told me everything I needed to know about their decision. They would rather lose their house than admit the truth about what had been happening in our family for the past 18 months. I was grading math worksheets during my lunch break when my phone finally rang at 12:47. Mom's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with a heavy heart, prepared to hear that they had decided to sell the house rather than accept my conditions. Lainey, we'd like to have Sunday dinner this week with the whole family present, she said without any greeting or explanation. Can you be here at 2 o'clock? The whole family, you, Carol, Aunt Patricia, Uncle Donald, Grandma Rose, and Cousin Michael. We've asked everyone to come because we have some important things we need to discuss. The formal tone of her voice suggested this wasn't going to be a typical family gathering with casual conversation and shared memories. This was going to be a reckoning. Did you tell them why you're calling this meeting? We told everyone that there have been some misunderstandings about our financial situation that need to be cleared up with the whole family present. We said it was important for everyone to hear the same information at the same time. I agreed to attend, though I felt nervous about facing extended family members who had been receiving distorted versions of our crisis for weeks. I spent Saturday evening preparing what I would say, organizing my documentation, and trying to anticipate how different people might respond to learning the truth. Sunday afternoon, I arrived at my parents' house to find cars already parked along the street. Aunt Patricia's rental car from the airport sat in the driveway next to Uncle Donald's pickup truck. Grandma Rose was being helped up the front steps by Cousin Michael, moving slowly, but determined to be part of whatever family drama required her presence. The living room had been rearranged to accommodate everyone with extra chairs borrowed from the dining room and kitchen. Carol was already there, sitting in the corner, looking pale and anxious. She barely made eye contact when I entered the room, focusing instead on her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her. Once everyone was seated, Dad stood up in front of the fireplace with the formal posture he used for important business presentations during his working years. Thank you all for coming on short notice. He began, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to make a difficult confession. Margaret and I asked you here because our family has been dealing with some serious financial problems, and there's been a lot of confusion about how those problems have been addressed. He gestured toward the coffee table where he had arranged copies of my bank statements, payment records, and loan documentation for everyone to examine. 3 weeks ago, we learned some information that completely changed our understanding of how our household bills have been paid for the past 18 months. We want to share that information with all of you because many of you have heard partial stories, and we think it's important for everyone to know the complete truth." Aunt Patricia looked confused as she picked up one of the bank statements. "Tom, what kind of financial problems are we talking about?" "When my printing business failed during the pandemic, we fell behind on our mortgage and utility payments. We were facing foreclosure and didn't know how to handle the situation." Mom took over the explanation from her seat on the sofa, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "What we didn't know was that Lainey had discovered our financial crisis and had been secretly paying our bills for a year and a half. Every month she was transferring money from her teaching salary to cover our mortgage utilities and emergency expenses." The room went completely silent as family members absorbed this information. Uncle Donald was examining payment receipts with the same careful attention Dad had shown when I first revealed the truth. "But we thought Carol was helping with your finances," Aunt Patricia said, looking back and forth between my parents and my sister. Dad's expression was grave as he continued the explanation. "Carol was aware of Lainey's payments for several months, but instead of telling us the truth, she allowed us to believe that she was managing our finances through her business connections." Carol finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was protecting everyone's feelings. When I discovered what Lainey was doing, I didn't want Mom and Dad to feel guilty about her sacrifices. But you also didn't correct us when we praised you for solving our financial problems." Mom said, her tone gentle but firm. "And you didn't tell us when your own investments failed and you couldn't actually provide the help you had been claiming to arrange." Grandma Rose, who had been listening quietly from her chair near the window, suddenly spoke with the clarity and directness that had made her the family's unofficial truth teller for decades. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," she said, adjusting her glasses to look directly at Carol. "Lainey has been paying your parents' bills for 18 months while living on a teacher's salary. You knew about this for at least 6 months, but continued accepting credit for financial help you weren't actually providing. And during this time, you were spending your own money on risky investments instead of contributing to your parents' expenses." "It's more complicated than that, Grandma," Carol protested weakly. "It's exactly that simple," Rose replied sharply. "I've been asking pointed questions about your sudden wealth and generous financial assistance for months because your stories didn't make sense. Real estate agents don't have the kind of banking connections you were claiming, and successful business people don't need to borrow pickup trucks to move furniture." Uncle Donald looked up from the payment records with an expression of amazement and shame. "Lainey, I owe you a tremendous apology. When your dad called me about this situation, I completely misunderstood what had happened. I thought you were playing some kind of manipulation game instead of literally keeping your parents from losing their home." Cousin Michael was shaking his head as he examined the timeline of payments and family conversations. "This explains so much about the inconsistencies in everyone's stories. Carol, how could you let Lainey struggle financially while you took credit for her work?" The climactic twist revealed itself as family members began to understand the scope of deception that had been operating under their noses. Not only had they been lied to about the family's financial situation, but they had been unknowingly participating in a system that punished generosity while rewarding manipulation. The silence that followed Grandma Rose's pointed questions stretched uncomfortably long. Family members sat processing what they had learned, occasionally glancing at documents or looking between Carol and me with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning understanding to outright anger. Aunt Patricia was the first to break the silence, setting down the bank statements she had been examining and looking directly at my parents. "Tom and Margaret, I need to apologize to you both, and especially to Lainey," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "When you called me 3 weeks ago, I completely misunderstood the situation. I thought Lainey had been playing some kind of control game with secret payments, so I lectured her about family communication and trust." She turned to face me directly, her eyes filled with genuine remorse. "Honey, I'm so sorry. I had no idea you had been sacrificing your own financial security to keep your parents from losing their home. When I think about how I criticized you for being manipulative when you were actually being incredibly generous, I feel sick about it." Uncle Donald nodded in agreement, his face flushed with embarrassment. I did the same thing, Lainey. Your dad called me upset about the situation, but the way he explained it made it sound like you were causing problems rather than solving them. I should have asked more questions instead of just assuming you were in the wrong. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing that his version of events had contributed to family members' negative reactions toward me. That's my fault, he admitted reluctantly. When I first learned about Lainey's payments, I was so embarrassed and confused that I focused on feeling deceived rather than feeling grateful. When I talked to family members about what happened, I emphasized the secrecy rather than the generosity. Mom was nodding slowly, her eyes fixed on her hands as she spoke. We both handled this terribly. Instead of thanking Lainey for her sacrifices, we made her feel guilty for not handling the situation exactly the way we thought she should have. Cousin Michael was still examining the payment timeline, cross-referencing dates with family conversations and social media posts from the past year. This is incredible, he said, looking up at me with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Lainey, you were paying $1,200 a month out of a teacher's salary, while everyone in the family was praising Carol for her financial success and business connections. How did you manage to live on what was left? Ramen noodles and generic groceries, I replied honestly. No restaurants, no new clothes, no weekend trips, no entertainment expenses. Everything went to keeping their house safe from foreclosure. Grandma Rose made a sound of disgust from her chair by the window. While you were eating ramen noodles to pay their bills, Carol was buying luxury cars and designer clothes with real estate commissions, then taking credit for your work. All eyes turned to Carol, who had been sitting silently throughout most of the conversation. Her face was pale, and I could see tears forming as she realized the full impact of her deception being exposed to the entire family. I never meant for it to get so complicated, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. When I first found out about Lainey's payments, I thought it would be easier for everyone if Mom and Dad believed the help was coming through my business connections. I didn't want them to feel guilty about Lainey's sacrifices. But then you started believing your own lies, Grandma Rose observed with devastating accuracy. You enjoyed the praise and admiration so much that you couldn't bring yourself to tell the truth, even when it meant watching your sister struggle while you prospered. Carol broke down completely at this point, sobbing as she tried to explain her motivations and decision-making process. I convinced myself that I was protecting everyone's feelings, but the truth is, I liked being seen as the successful daughter who was taking care of the family. I liked having Mom and Dad be proud of me for once, instead of always worrying about my choices. The admission hung in the air like a confession at a trial. After months of manipulation and lies, Carol was finally acknowledging the selfish motivations that had driven her behavior. And when your investments failed, Uncle Donald asked pointedly, I panicked, she admitted. I had lost $60,000 on cryptocurrency speculation, and I was in debt on my credit cards because I had been spending money I didn't really have. When the bills started coming due and I couldn't actually provide the help I had been promising, I begged Lainey to restart the payments while I figured out how to fix my mistakes. Dad was staring at Carol with an expression I had never seen before, as if he was looking at a stranger instead of his daughter. So let me understand this completely, he said slowly. For 6 months, you knew that Lainey was draining her savings to pay our bills, but you continued accepting our gratitude and praise for financial help you weren't providing. You used the money she saved us to gamble on risky investments, and when those investments failed, you asked her to bail out not just us, but you as well. Yes, Carol whispered, unable to meet his eyes. The climactic twist was devastating in its simplicity. My family was finally seeing Carol's behavior without the filters of denial, rationalization, or misplaced loyalty that had protected her from accountability for months. The family gathering continued for another hour as relatives processed the revelations and asked clarifying questions about timeline and details. Throughout this discussion, Carol remained largely silent, occasionally offering weak explanations or apologies that fell flat against the weight of evidence and family disappointment. As people began preparing to leave, gathering their coats and saying their goodbyes, Carol finally seemed to realize that her position in the family had fundamentally shifted. The sister who had been praised and admired just hours earlier was now facing the consequences of deception that could no longer be minimized or explained away. "I think everyone is overreacting to what was essentially a misunderstanding about communication," she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge as she stood up from her corner chair. The room went quiet again as family members turned to look at her with expressions of disbelief. "A misunderstanding," Grandma Rose repeated slowly. "Is that really how you're choosing to characterize 6 months of deliberately stealing credit for your sister's financial sacrifices?" "I wasn't stealing anything," Carol protested, her voice growing louder with desperation. "I was trying to manage a complicated family situation in a way that protected everyone's feelings. If Lainey had just been honest from the beginning instead of playing secret benefactor, none of this confusion would have happened." Aunt Patricia shook her head with visible frustration. "Carol, we just spent an hour reviewing 18 months of bank records that prove Lainey was paying your parents' bills while you took credit for her work. How is that a misunderstanding about communication? Because the real problem is that Lainey created this situation by being secretive and controlling," Carol replied, her voice taking on the manipulative tone I recognized from our private conversations. She chose to pay their bills anonymously instead of involving the family in decisions about how to handle their financial crisis. Dad stood up from his chair with an expression of growing anger. "Stop blaming your sister for your choices, Carol. Lainey's decision to help us secretly doesn't excuse your decision to lie about providing help you weren't actually giving." But Carol was committed to her narrative, now apparently believing that attacking me was her best strategy for avoiding accountability. "You want to know the truth?" she said, her voice rising with emotion. "I've always felt like I had to compete with Lainey for approval in this family. She's the one with the stable teaching job and the responsible lifestyle, while I've struggled with inconsistent real estate income and financial pressures. When I found out she was secretly supporting you, it felt like another example of her being the perfect daughter, while I was seen as the failure. So you decided to steal credit for her work instead of addressing your own insecurities?" Mom asked, her voice sharp with disappointment. "I decided to protect this family from unnecessary drama by managing the situation quietly. If everyone had just appreciated that I was trying to help, instead of analyzing every detail of how the help was being provided, we could have avoided all of this conflict." Cousin Michael was shaking his head as he listened to Carol's justifications. "You're talking about 18 months of deception like it was a minor miscommunication. You watched Lainey struggle financially while you bought luxury items with real estate commissions, then took credit for generosity you weren't capable of providing." The confrontation reached its climax when Uncle Donald asked the question that cut through all of Carol's rationalizations and excuses. "Carol, here's what I don't understand. Even if we accept that you initially thought you were protecting everyone's feelings, why didn't you tell the truth when you realized your investments had failed and you couldn't actually provide the financial help you had been promising?" Carol's response revealed the depth of her selfishness and manipulation in a way that shocked even me. Because I knew that if I admitted the truth, you would all see me as a failure who had been lying to the family for months. I thought if I could convince Lainey to restart the payments temporarily, I could figure out how to make my investments profitable again and eventually cover the expenses myself. "So you were willing to let Mom and Dad lose their house, rather than admit you had been lying about helping them?" Dad asked, his voice filled with a sadness I had never heard before. "I was trying to find a solution that would work for everyone," Carol said weakly. "No," Grandma Rose said with finality, "you were trying to find a solution that would work for you, even if it meant destroying your sister financially and your parents' housing security." The room fell silent as the full scope of Carol's selfishness became clear to everyone present. She hadn't been protecting the family's feelings or managing a complicated situation. She had been protecting her own reputation and image while sacrificing the welfare of everyone she claimed to love. When it became obvious that no one was going to support her version of events or excuse her behavior, Carol made one final attempt to manipulate the situation. "Fine," she said, grabbing her purse and jacket with angry, jerky movements. "If this family wants to treat me like a villain for trying to help in my own way, then maybe I don't need to be part of this family anymore." She headed toward the front door, clearly expecting someone to call after her and beg her to stay. "Maybe some time apart would be good for everyone," Dad said quietly, making no effort to stop her departure. Carol paused at the door, apparently surprised that her dramatic exit wasn't having the intended effect. "You'll regret this when you realize how much I actually do for this family," she said, her voice filled with bitter resentment. "What we regret," Mom replied sadly, "is that it took us so long to see who you really are underneath all the lies and manipulation." The climactic twist revealed itself as Carol walked out of the house. Her final manipulation attempt had backfired completely, showing the family that she was more concerned with maintaining her false image than with taking responsibility for the pain she had caused. 3 months after the family confrontation, our lives had settled into patterns that would have been unimaginable during the worst days of the crisis. The foreclosure threat was a memory, my parents' bills were current and manageable, and our family relationships were healing in ways that felt genuine and sustainable for the first time in years. I had honored my commitment to cover the outstanding debts and provide 6 months of financial support while my parents stabilized their situation. The loan agreements we established were working exactly as planned, with Dad making his first $200 payment ahead of schedule and Mom contributing an additional $50 from her part-time job at the library. But more importantly, the complete transparency we had fought for was transforming how our family communicated about everything, not just money. Sunday dinners became opportunities for honest conversations about work challenges, relationship concerns, and future goals, instead of performative updates designed to impress each other. Dad had found part-time consulting work helping small businesses navigate insurance and regulatory requirements using the expertise he had developed during his 30 years of running his own company. The work provided enough income to cover their basic expenses, plus it restored his sense of professional competence and personal dignity. Mom had channeled her organizational skills into a position at the local library, where she helped seniors navigate computer systems and online resources. The job paid modestly, but it connected her with a community of people who appreciated her patience and expertise. Most significantly, they had sold their large house and purchased a smaller, more manageable home that they could afford independently. The downsizing process had been emotional, but ultimately liberating as they realized how much of their stress had come from maintaining a lifestyle that was beyond their means. "I actually love this little house," Mom told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings. "It's easier to clean, cheaper to heat, and we don't feel overwhelmed by maintenance projects we can't afford to hire out." The extended family relationships had also improved dramatically once the truth became public knowledge. Aunt Patricia called regularly to check on everyone and had become a reliable source of emotional support during difficult transitions. Uncle Donald offered practical help with home repairs and moving logistics, while Cousin Michael provided technology assistance for Dad's consulting business. Grandma Rose, whose sharp questions had helped expose Carol's deception, became the family's unofficial mediator when minor conflicts arose. Her ability to cut through emotional manipulation and focus on factual reality made her an invaluable resource for maintaining healthy communication patterns. The situation with Carol was more complicated and gradual. After her dramatic exit from the family confrontation, she had maintained radio silence for 6 weeks, apparently expecting someone to reach out and apologize for holding her accountable. When that didn't happen, she began sending tentative text messages to Mom and Dad, testing whether they were ready to resume their relationship on the old terms, where her behavior wasn't questioned or criticized. But our parents had learned too much about themselves and their family dynamics to return to previous patterns of enabling and denial. "We love you and you'll always be our daughter," Dad told her during their first phone conversation after the confrontation. "But we can't have a relationship that's built on lies and manipulation anymore. If you want to be part of this family, you need to take responsibility for what happened and work to rebuild trust." Carol's initial response was anger and resentment, followed by attempts to negotiate partial responsibility that would allow her to maintain some of her victim narrative. But when it became clear that our parents weren't going to compromise on their requirements for honesty and accountability, she finally began the difficult work of genuine self-reflection. She entered financial counseling to address her gambling behavior, and spending problems started therapy to explore her competitive feelings toward me, and took a part-time job at a debt counseling center, where she learned about the real-world consequences of financial deception. The process was slow and sometimes frustrating, but gradually Carol began making genuine apologies that acknowledged specific harm instead of offering vague regrets about misunderstandings. She repaid the first installment of money she owed me from her cryptocurrency losses, and she publicly corrected false information she had shared with extended family members about the financial crisis. "I'm beginning to understand that I spent so many years trying to look successful that I forgot how to actually be successful," she told me during one of our supervised conversations with a family therapist. "I was so focused on managing other people's perceptions that I lost track of my own values and integrity." The rebuilding process required patience and vigilance from everyone involved, but it was creating a foundation for relationships based on truth rather than convenience. For me personally, the experience had taught profound lessons about the relationship between generosity and self-respect. My anonymous financial support had been motivated by genuine love and concern for my parents, but it had also enabled a system of dysfunction that ultimately hurt everyone involved. I learned that real generosity requires honest relationships. I reflected during one of our family therapy sessions. When I kept my help secret, I was protecting my own comfort as much as theirs. I was avoiding difficult conversations about money, pride, and family responsibility that we needed to have. The therapist had helped us understand that my secrecy, while well-intentioned, had created space for manipulation and deception to flourish. True family support required transparency, mutual respect, and shared responsibility rather than hidden martyrdom. "Anonymous giving can be appropriate in some situations," she explained, "but within families it often creates power imbalances and communication problems that damage relationships over time." I had also learned to recognize and value my own worth instead of finding identity through self-sacrifice. The months of living on ramen noodles and generic groceries had taught me that I couldn't save other people by destroying myself financially or emotionally. "You can't pour from an empty cup" became my new motto for helping others. If you sacrifice everything for other people, you become unable to provide genuine support when it's most needed. As I sat in my parents' new living room on a Sunday afternoon in August, watching Dad help Mom arrange flowers from their garden while we waited for dinner to finish cooking, I realized we had achieved something more valuable than financial stability. We'd created a family culture based on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine care, rather than performance and manipulation. The foreclosure notices and past due bills were gone, but more importantly, so were the lies and deceptions that had poisoned our relationships. We could disagree about decisions, express concerns about each other's choices, and ask for help when needed without fear of judgment or rejection. "I'm proud of how we've all grown through this experience," Dad said as we gathered around their smaller but more welcoming dinner table. "It took a crisis to teach us how to be honest with each other, but we're a stronger family now than we were when everything seemed perfect on the surface." As we joined hands for grace before the meal, I reflected on the profound truth we had discovered through our painful journey. Genuine love and support flourish in environments of honesty and transparency, while secrecy and deception create space for manipulation and resentment to destroy the very relationships we're trying to protect. The ultimate life lesson had crystallized through our experience. True family bonds are built on mutual respect and open communication, not on hidden sacrifices or stolen credit. When we have the courage to be vulnerable and honest with the people we love, we create opportunities for authentic connection and mutual growth that can survive any crisis. Financial problems had brought us together, but emotional honesty had made us a family worth being part of. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where your generosity wasn't acknowledged, or where family dynamics made it difficult to help in the way you wanted? How do you balance supporting loved ones while maintaining healthy boundaries and honest communication? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it resonated with your own experiences with family and financial challenges. Subscribe for more stories about real-life situations and the lessons we learn when we choose truth over comfort. And please share this with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the importance of transparency in family relationships. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to enable dysfunction, even when it's painful in the short term. I hope your own family relationships are built on the foundation of honesty and mutual respect that makes genuine love possible.